Pacific Viewpoint is proudly brought to you by South Pacific Loans, caring for the community's financial needs. Call us today on 0800 88 98 88.
Good evening and welcome to Pacific Viewpoint. ACC has been in the limelight lately, with the government planning to open the work account, allowing private companies to compete and provide a choice for employer insurance. The proposal is set to take place in October next year, but some have come out in strong opposition, claiming it will not bring levies down and instead bring in profit-driven policies with little or no social responsibility. Here on the program to discuss the issue are Green MP Kevin Hague and Pacific Representative and lawyer Amelia Saafi. Good evening, Mr. Hague and Amelia Saafi. What is wrong with the government's plan to privatise work coverage of ACC?
Well, I think that there's two basic problems. One is that ACC is a system that essentially is working well, has been the envy of the world, in fact, and there is no need to actually change it. The second point is that the change that the government intends to make will open up the account to competition from private insurance companies. Those companies all need to make a profit. That's what companies do. Now, the profit can only come in two ways: by increasing the income, so putting the levies up, or by reducing the costs. And that means less treatment, less compensation, less rehabilitation. Those are the ways that those insurance companies can actually make a profit. So that's good for them, but bad for New Zealand and bad for workers.
What is that for us, Pacific Islanders?
Yeah, as Kevin has said, they're going to, insurance companies are there for the profit, and what will happen is they'll deny claims so that they can maximise their profits.
So you're saying that ACC is there for a profit?
ACC is there to manage it. It's not a business. It's run on a business model, but it's also got social responsibilities. So it's quite different from how an insurance company will operate, because they are there for profits and for dividends for their shareholders, so private shareholders.
In what way would the Pacific Islanders be hurt by this plan?
They will be hurt when their claims are denied, because as I said, insurance companies are there to make a profit, and to make a profit they'll have to cut on certain things, and they will make it harder for claims to be accepted, or they will pay less for rehabilitation, and that will affect Pacific Island workers, because they will have to then challenge, and it just gets too hard for them to pursue their rights if that happens. Or, I'm pretty sure, and most other commentators have said that that's a very likely consequence if the government proposals go ahead.
No, I think Amelia is completely correct. I think that Pacific workers will be amongst the hardest hit by these consequences, because they'll be in a position where they are amongst the least likely to be able to challenge those decisions. So I think what the government is planning here is extremely bad for Pacific people.
You said in your media statement, and I can read it from your media statement, I can assure the New Zealand public and any companies looking to take over accident coverage from ACC that this privatisation will be overturned by a Green or Labour government. Is this a political threat?
Well, I guess people could see it that way. I've certainly been very clear from the beginning of this idea being floated by the government that this is something that is absolutely wrong, and if we are ever in a position to reverse it as being part of a government, we will do. And I've heard Chris Hipkins, who's the Labour Party ACC spokesperson, say the same thing. Now, people can see it as a threat if they like. I would say that it's actually a good business planning signal for those insurance companies. The same thing happened last time that National was in power. They actually did open up the work account of ACC to competition, and insurance companies started to get into that, and it was reversed by Labor. I think it's only fair to those companies to know that if they choose to get into this business, that when we have something to do about it, we actually will reverse it out.
So more likely, if Labor will win this next election, Green will be governing with Labor Party.
It's most likely that that Labor and the Greens will be in some kind of coalition the next time that we get the opportunity to form a government, which I believe will be in November this year. And when we do, this is one of the first things that Greens are going to put on the agenda for changing.
You also state on your media statement that the accident victim will not have a fair go under a private insurance system. In what way?
I think that that workers who have accidents will be denied their rights in a variety of ways. First of all, I think that it's quite likely that the insurance company that holds the policy for their employer will be doing everything that they can to say that this injury was caused in some other way, so that they don't have to provide compensation, they don't have to provide treatment, they don't have to provide rehabilitation. So I think we're likely to see more and more workers miss out on those things that are basic rights that are guaranteed to them by successive New Zealand governments for nearly 40 years now. So I think that there's that erosion of rights. There's also another point, and that's the point that employers and insurance companies will have incentives to underreport accidents. And so I think what we're going to see is an erosion of that workplace health and safety culture that many of us have worked hard over many years to try and engender, because the more accidents that a workplace has, the greater premiums will become. So they have a very strong incentive to underreport, and I think that's bad for workers and bad for our country.
They reported some figures on accredited employers programs where bigger employers are self-managing the claims from employees, and I think they said that there were 12% fewer claims and also 15% lower costs. They might say that because they are more efficient and more business-like, but I would question that. I think that they are reducing or denying claims so that they produce lower figures to show that they are doing a wonderful job. So I would like those figures to be looked at more closely, and that's what's going to likely to happen if insurers, private insurers are involved. Right. That there will be fewer claims and fewer costs paid out because they have ways to reduce those costs, and it can only be bad for workers.
Why do you think is the government looking to Australian insurance companies instead of what's wrong with NZI, AMI, state insurance, Tower?
Well, of course, many of those New Zealand insurance companies, or companies that we think of as New Zealand companies, are actually Australian-owned. And what we've seen is that even before they became the government, the National Party was in negotiation really with those big Australian insurance companies.
Before they came to power?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely?
Absolutely. Over exactly this plan to actually reintroduce competition into the work account, which we would say is actually privatisation. So there's been a long-term intent from National to do this. And so I think it's no surprise that more or less everything that they have done about ACC has been leading towards this precise outcome.
Do you think that this is one way of the government wanting to build our economy by privatising any part of the government departments like ACC?
The government has, they've justified this idea of the privatisation, which they dispute that term, but they say competition in the work account. The government says they are doing that because it will put pressure on ACC to reduce its costs and become more efficient. That's their sole justification for it. The government is not saying this is going to lead to a more robust economy or anything like that. It's purely about ACC reducing its costs. Now, I think it's quite likely that ACC, in competition with the private sector, will be inclined to reduce its costs, but the costs it will reduce are the ones involved with compensation, treatment, rehabilitation, those basic rights, those basic functions that ACC has. It will become a race to the bottom between privately owned insurance companies and ACC. It's just a disaster for our country.
What do you think the motive behind the government's decision to...
One never knows their motives, you need to ask them, but I think it's pure
Let's
ideology.
Yeah.
That, private, it's not a secret that national and represents big business, and also they are ideologically driven and say the private sector is best. But as we know, is what happened with the world recession, it was the private sector that put us into that problem.
They said
the banks and
Green put us in this.
And then what happens with the government usually ends up sweeping the mess of the private sector. And you look at Air New Zealand was rescued by the government, and now they're going to partially privatise Air New Zealand. And there have been finance companies being rescued by the taxpayer. So privatisation is not, it's not the solution to any problems, because usually the taxpayer ends up paying.
I agree really strongly with Amelia. You know, this is a government that does have an ideology of private good, public bad, but the reality is pretty well usually that profits get privatised and costs and risks get socialised. You know, so it's the privatisation of government functions and state sector organisations is almost always bad for ordinary people.
Yeah, and what's going to happen is that the claims that are going to be problematic and complex claims, long-term claimants, they are going to be managed by ACC, not by the private insurance companies, because they cost more. And if private companies go down, then ACC will end up taking over those claims. So basically, ACC will end up with the messier problems that are costing more, and then private insurance companies will be taking the cream. And I think one comment I wish to make is that the Minister of ACC, Nick Smith, compared what they're doing with, or they're proposing to do with ACC to television and radio. And there's quite a difference between television and radio. It's like having goods and services. These are services to human beings that are quite different from watching TV and having a TV or radio programs.
Do you think your viewpoints, because you're actually giving a lot of viewpoints on this program, do you think you represent the viewpoints of our Pacific people here in New Zealand?
I think I'm representing views that that I know. I'm advocating for consequences that I see that are going to be bad from the proposals by the government, bad for Pacific people and Pacific workers.
I came from Tonga in 2006. I need a future here with my family. I decided to buy a house. I went to the bank and they turned me down. So I went to South Pacific Loan and they decided to give me a second chance. So they upgrade my credit, and then I went back to the bank and they offered me a loan. And then I buy this house and here I am today. I highly recommend anyone who haven't tried South Pacific Loan, try South Pacific Loan, because they give me a chance to be here with my house today.
Give us a call or come and see us. because we understand the Pacific people.
Mo le lafo ina tupe Samoa ma Australia ma Tonga. Piki tupe Australia ma Samoa pe tu ufo i social accounts i New Zealand nei. Whaatau tongi nei piki a mau. Whaia siaki talaina i le malai waalele. Talaina o mātou tupe a pia i le Nick Money Transfer. Po sa vai i le Marie Money Transfer. O le mātou tuatusi o le numera fitu Princess Street o tau. Talaina le mātou ofisa le afa le valu le taeao i le lima i le afiafi. Asonga fua i le asfareile, ma le afa le valu le taeao le afa sulua le astonai. Pafsota i mai le mātou telefoni i le lua fitu o whāwalu o le lua fitu ono lua tolu whātasi. Mo nisi whamatalanga, whautai tele Samoa i laulalako mai.
You also state on your media statement that there was financial crisis in ACC in 2009, but it was now clear that it was manufactured by the government. Is that so?
I think there's no question that the government has manufactured the appearance of a financial crisis in ACC to undermine public confidence and therefore to build a constituency, build support amongst the public for it taking drastic action, such as it now has done. The fact is that in that same year that the government claimed ACC was in financial crisis, it had reserves of over $10 billion. It actually had took more than $1 billion in levies over and above its costs. So the appearance of a financial crisis occurred only because the National Party had a policy of trying to fund ACC as if it were a private insurance company. And what private insurance companies have to do is take in their income and premiums has to meet the costs for a lifetime of any accidents that occurred that year. So that's the way that the government has chosen to fund ACC, both national and Labor governments, in fact. Now, that's not how we fund any other government service. If you think about health services, for example, when the money we take in tax and give to the health services has to fund the costs of providing health services in that year alone. It's not funding the lifetime health consequences of someone becoming ill. So if we were to fund ACC in that way, as was originally intended, in fact, and as the Green Party supports, then all of a sudden crisis disappears. In fact, ACC is in an extremely robust financial position, and probably we could afford to reduce levies. The only reason, actually, to fund ACC as if it were a private insurance company is to facilitate competition with private health insurance companies. Because if they don't fund it that way, the private insurance companies complain that ACC is being given an unfair advantage.
So do you think that John Key and the government lied to us in 2009?
I probably wouldn't use the lie word, but what I would say is that John Key's government gave a misleading picture to lead the public to believe that there was a financial crisis in ACC.
So in some aspect, there was a little white lie.
I would say that what they said was not overall true. Did you know that I'm a politician? Yes. I mean, they would. I mean, from the perspective of saying, if we are trying to fund ACC as if it were a private insurance company, then the extra surpluses that they're needing to make to try and be able to fund the lifetime costs of all accidents, that was not happening as fast as they had projected for it to do. They would claim that that's the financial crisis. I would say, abandon that stupid goal and you don't have a crisis anymore.
I mean, you can be given some figures and you can have so many different interpretations. And when I personally heard what the government had announced there was a crisis,
in
I
2009?
knew that there was something behind it.
Or did you?
Because when you say there's a crisis somewhere, then you know that it's preparing the public for changes to be made, to justify those changes. Because you can argue the fine points, but the people will believe, some people will believe there's a crisis.
It's exactly.
And you say a crisis, and then you have to fix that crisis.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting, Amelia, but it's exactly what we see again and again. If we saw it in 1984 when Rogernomics was foisted on the New Zealand public. Why would that happen? Well, because we have a financial crisis that justifies extreme action without the normal public safeguards. And this is a tactic that this government has used many times.
And are you saying you're not doing that?
The
The Green Party and Labour?
No, we're absolutely not. I mean, we do think that there are some crises. We think there's a crisis in supporting poor New Zealanders, for example, and that actually urgent action is justified there. We think there's a crisis in the environment that requires urgent action. But actually, ACC financial position, not a crisis.
And I think the government, you can probably say, they're either clever or sly. They
That's a nice
present
way of putting it.
terrible things like for example, the Working Party on welfare reform, and they give these extreme measures, and then the government will do something more moderate. So it's sort of like you get used to it, and people who see through what the government is doing or proposing. It's the same thing here. They're not saying we are privatizing, because most New Zealanders oppose privatization, but they're saying we are providing competition. ACC is still there. So in a way, they're very clever or manipulative or sly in how they're presenting things to people. I mean, good on them, that's how politics is, but I think people just need to
be sly.
Not the Green Party.
and just I mean, people just need to take
You just crash my belief on politicians.
step back and look at what each party is presenting and see, is this really the case? And I think that's what I say to Pacific people. You look at what's being presented, you question it, because you don't want to be led by somebody somewhere that you don't want to be.
And sometimes the things that are not presented speaks louder than what has been presented. Amelia, you are a lawyer and one of our Tongan community leaders here in New Zealand. If ACC will be taken over by Australian insurance companies, do you think this will hurt our Pacific community?
Yes, as I said before, it will hurt if they are given the chance to compete with ACC. As I said, they'll be trying to reduce everything that they pay out in rehabilitation, in claims, and will need to denial of claims. And as a consequence, Pacific workers will suffer because they do not normally pursue their rights in employment or ACC, just because they don't know their rights. Or in some cases, they have other things that they worry about and are more important to them than having to go through a process that's foreign to them of challenging those decisions.
So what do you want to see done?
Well, I would like to see National not go through with these proposals. And of course, if Labour and the Greens form a government, then these proposals will certainly not go ahead. And I think that can only be good for Pacific people.
And what do you want to see done?
I'd like to see Amelia being made a parliamentary colleague of mine, because that was absolutely right. You know, this privatisation, it's all downside, it's all negative for New Zealand and New Zealanders, and the only upside is to those Australian insurance companies. Maybe there's an upside to National that we don't know about, but actually what we really require is for this ridiculous change to be abandoned, and abandoned now rather than waiting for us to have to reverse it.
Kevin, Amelia, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I came from Tonga in 2006. I need a future here with my family. I decided to buy a house. I went to the bank and they turned me down. So I went to South Pacific Loan and they decided to give me a second chance. So they upgrade my credit, and then I went back to the bank and they offered me a loan. And then I buy this house and here I am today. I highly recommend anyone who haven't tried South Pacific Loan, try South Pacific Loan, because they give me a chance to be here with my house today.
Give us a call or come and see us because we understand the Pacific people.
Mo lafo ina tupe Samoa ma Australia ma Tonga. Piki tupe Australia ma Samoa pe tu ufo iso se account i New Zealand nei. Whaatau tongi nei piki a mau. Whaia siaki talaina i malai lele. Talaina o mātou tupe a pia i le Nick Money Transfer. Po sa vai i le Marie Money Transfer. O le mātou tuatusi o numera fitu Princess Street o tau. Talaina le mātou ofisa le afa le valu le taeao i le lima i le afiafi. Asonga fua le asfareile, ma le afa le valu le taeao le afa sfulu le astonai. Pafsota i mai le mātou telefoni i le lua fitu o whāwalu o le lua fitu ono lua tolu whātasi. Mo nisi whamatalanga, whautai tele Samoa i laulalogo mai.
Well, that's all we have time for on tonight's program. If you have any issue you would like us to address, you can contact us on myviewpoint@pacifica.tv. See you next time. Bye for now.